Session 1.
Okay, let's get started. Let's put up, we're going to work with light, very light values today, if we can. So yellow is our light value. Gold is surprisingly darker than you think, but you could add a little gold to your yellow. Orange, red, with plenty of yellow mixed in would be a light value. So you want to put down a couple of analogous colors on your palette. And you don't need too much, the size of a quarter or so, and that will be good for today. What we're going to do is build light backgrounds. In addition to even solid colors, we're going to play with dividing up the space and leaving some white in the paper, because it's hard to get white back once you've gone dark. So that's why we're starting again with light values. Here I've added plenty of water. I'm mixing my inks with a palette knife, mash, pull, draw until it is nice and smooth. That's, if you want a smooth application of ink, then you want a smooth mix of ink. So I'm taking my brayer, pulling a small amount out from the blob on my palette and applying it to the plate. Again, thin layers, so I put down a small amount and then I'm spreading it out with my brayer. I like using like a 3.5-inch brayer, 2.5-inch brayer, small brayer since we're working small. Lay down my framing mat, line up my paper, and burnish. Now you want to, when you burnish, make sure you get in the corners because they will define the edges of your print. So that's a nice, light, even value. So you could do 10 of those if you wanted. You can't go wrong with light, even values. Here, did you notice how I framed up the strip of yellow? I left some open space on the left side and some lighter values on the right. So where you place your framing mat can determine how you frame up and print on the paper. Here, a couple of strokes, and I've left it blobby and uneven. I do have white space around those blobs. So what I'm doing here is using the brayer with limited strokes to create a textured or interesting light layer to begin with. And because there was lots of ink left on there, I did a ghost impression. So those actually, the lighter you can go with this process, the happier you'll probably be in the end. Here, I would say this orange is quite dark, not ideally lightness for this first layer. I left some white at the top though, because once you go dark, you have to go even darker to make a distinction between your marks, textures, and impressions. But I do have plenty of ink on there, so I could reposition my framing mat and pull a ghost impression. I could do this a couple of times actually. So it's not a bad thing to get a thick layer and then you have a very thin layer left on your plate that you can reposition the framing mat a couple of times and get a couple of very light impressions. And what I'm doing here is I'm noticing where and how I'm dividing up the space. I want to avoid dividing up the space in half, left and right and top and bottom. So I usually put things off to the side a little bit. You could ink up only part of the plate. And here I'm going to lightly spritz a solid layer, lay down my framing mat, leave a little bit of white, and this will give me a watery impression. And I could pull a couple of sheets of paper with this. It gives you cool little watery dots. So it's a light texture. That is a great way of beginning this process. Here I've got some yellow blobs. I can decide whether to even it out with my brayer or leave them as blobs. That framing it up, leaving the orange and the yellow. Clean fingers. Over here outside of the screen I have a wet rag and then a dry rag, and I clean my fingers with a wet rag and then dry them. So you want your hands to be clean and dry to keep the edges of your print dry. If you get fingerprints on there, I'm going to show you how to get rid of them. Here is a wet, patterned roll, very wet ink on my palette. I'm framing it up, leaving some whites left and right. Line up my paper, burnish all the way to the edge. So I've got some white areas left and a lot of texture going on there. So that could be one thing you're looking for. Plenty of white and a little bit of texture. I repositioned the framing mat, got a fresh piece of paper, and I've started to divide up the impressions with the ink that was left under the framing mat. It gives you these cool right angle shapes. And you can lay a couple of them on a single sheet and have an interesting effect. As you're working through the day, you may need to spritz your ink so that you get light layers. So I always have my water bottle there, ready to add a tiny bit of water to the ink on the palette so that I can get a nice thin application. Here I did a yellow and gold roll, very light. And I missed the tiny bit of corner, so I'm lining that up with the framing mat and just burnishing that corner. That seems to be important to me because the edges of your marks kind of divide the edge of the print so that when you frame it or hang it, it's nice to have a clean edge. Here I just did one strip of ink with a 3-inch brayer, and I have plenty of white left there for my subsequent layers. So the whole process of this first day of printing is to build 20 or 30 or even more, because we'll circle back to this, 20 or 30 light layered prints. And if you're new, you're going to figure out how little ink you need to get a light layer. You'll learn that you have delicious ghost impressions if you actually end up putting heavier layers on the palette. Here, what's going on is I've taken a bit of magenta out of a jar, and it is very dry. Now, this has speeded up a lot, but I wanted to show you how, if your ink is dry out of the tube or can, you add water and mash and scrape and pull until it gets to be nice and smooth. Keep adding water, drag it against the palette, and you should be able to reactivate it. Here, very thick layer, but it's got some spots of white opening, so who knows, maybe that'll be okay. So I've put down a rough layer, lining up my paper, burnish, peel it up. That's pretty dark, but we can play with that. But it does leave a nice ghost impression underneath. So we'll get a fresh piece of paper, burnish, and that's light enough to build on. So as you may notice, the colors I've chosen are all analogous, so when they mix, they're not going to make mud. I have magenta, yellow, orange, and gold. The magenta is getting a little bit dark, but we can play with it. I've left some white or yellow on the bottom. Burnish, peel it back, and that's a nice even application of ink. Pick up the ghost impression, and it will probably be even more useful. If you do get too much ink on your plate, you can thin it out by rolling it on other areas of your plate where you are not printing. That'll discharge some of the ink off the brayer onto the plate, and then you could do random pickups with several pieces of paper. Again, cleaning my fingers. I'm doing this constantly. You may not see it in the video, but if you can keep your fingers clean and the edges clean, you'll be happier in the end. So with the magenta, though, I've got some cool shapes, and that's what I love about this off-printing from the framing mat, is the shapes that it creates. Angles, squares. So if you can twist your paper and layer them, you might find them interesting. What's interesting is that they are different size shapes and different values, and kind of delicate, like you have some darker areas, some lighter areas, a mix of colors, and it's all a little bit uncontrollable because it's all just random pickups from the ink that was left under your framing mat. Now, another thing that we can do with these light layers is put down a strip of color and then find us what I call a stamping tool. This is just a cup lid cover, and I stamp into the thin layer of ink. That picks up a little bit of ink on the edge of the cup, and then I off-print it several times in the white or clear area of the plate. Then I frame it up unevenly, so I have about 2/3 of color, 1/3 of white, and because I had a pretty thick application of ink, I will be able to get a ghost impression as well. And I think you'll find that these can be really great building blocks for subsequent prints. So I've spritzed it, it's pretty blobby, but I've evened it out with my brayer bit. Find a new stamping tool. So when you stamp into the ink for the very first time, you may need to stamp into it several times to get enough ink to build up on the tool. So again, try not to divide it directly in half. I'm using a strip of solid and a lot of open space, and that's going to give me a nice light layer as this first base layer. Another one of your objectives today could be to experiment with different stamping tools to see what kind of marks you can get and what kind of marks you like. Remember to spritz your ink often on the palette because it's water-based, it dries quite evenly. Here you can see I've got too much ink on my brayer, so I've extended the area where I'm inking the plate. That releases some of the ink out and makes it a little bit thinner. Notice what kind of stamping you do. I notice that I often do it very evenly and have to consciously decide to do it unevenly to make it a little more interesting. Did you notice how I have all that ink on there and I chose to print off an area that had plenty of white in interesting shapes and spaces? So with the leftover ink, I will be able to pull a couple more impressions. Notice how I've twisted my framing mat to accommodate the ink area. So that's one of the beauties of working on a big plate, but working on small paper, is that you can use the plate to hold impressions until you're ready to print them off. So with this one ink application, I've got at least 3 prints. So remember when you're framing up your print to look at the shape that the ink is creating within the framing mat. Is the shape off-centered? Is the shape creating shapes of different sizes that will create interest? We're not creating completed impressions or prints. We're just building light layers with lots of shapes and some texture. And we're really experimenting. Here are limited rolls with thick ink, white areas. So play with as many different techniques as you can think of to create light, interesting textural layers as a base for subsequent prints. You may want to, I would say probably stick with one set of colors for today, but if you start out and you really hate your colors, then definitely change. Cut glass is a fun stamping tool. Usually it picks up the detail quite intensely. You notice how I framed that up and left plenty of white space at the top. And this is using the stamped into mark and the stamped off mark. Because I've put the ink on thickly, I can get a light impression. And you can't see it here, but I am just stacking these prints all one on top of each other, unless, this is a watery one, unless it is a thick layer of ink, then I might set that one off to the side because that will take extra time to dry. Watery layers can give you some really fun texture, so remember to try that one today, which is, you can do it with watery ink on your palette, and then you can also do it with by spritzing the ink that's on the plate. And as you print today, you can never have too many light layers because once you find you start adding focal marks and other kinds of marks to the prints, you're always going to be wanting more and more light layers to print on top of. Here, that was like a bath mat shape. Rubber things that can make wonderful impressions in the ink. Just a kid's little block makes a great impression. So sometimes the simplest tools can often make interesting impressions. So I'm sure you can have some in the in the house. They don't have to be special artist tools. Here's a wood grain piece of wood that I found at the beach. So if you think it, try it, and you may be pleasantly surprised. Here, very light, stamping into that thin layer and not even using the thick layer of application, but just printing off the stamped marks. And there's a little residue on the plate that works nicely to build that light background. And I'm going to finish off with just a few solid yellow and orange impressions here. Again, keep everything super light and learn about your tools, learn about your brayers, try to keep your fingers clean, experiment with stamping tools, stamping into and off onto the plate. Use your plate to spread the ink out and get a thin application of ink. Alright, have some fun with this, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.